Has this ever happened to you before? I can't wait to go hang out with attractive women. I think I'll take the Lord's most practical, reliable, and stylish vehicle, the Jeep YJ. Dang it, not again! Well, my friends, look no further. Today, I'm going to be covering absolutely everything you need to know to diagnose a crank no start on your YJ. I'm fairly certain in my case I don't have a compression issue because this thing was running fine one week and not the next, but it never hurts to cover all your bases. The first thing we need to do is pull off our plug wires. Since this is a straight 6, Jeep made it easy on us. 1 is in the front and 6 is in the back. I've got pieces of painter's tape with numbers written on them just so I can keep track of them. Next up, we can pull the spark plugs out. I've got this little organizer that I use to write down all of the compression numbers when we get there and store the spark plugs as well. I've never been the best at reading spark plugs, but I don't see anything concerning here. In fact, they all look relatively new, and I don't see any oil on any of the threads, so I'm going to say there's nothing wrong with them. Next up, we need to crank the engine and feel for compression. If you have a compression tester, great. If you don't, I'm going to show another way as well. A lot of people like to use a friend and the key to crank the engine over, but I don't like that way simply because your spark plugs would still be sparking and your engine is still shooting fuel. I like to take a jumper wire and put it into the fuse box right next to you while you're feeling for compression and go about it that way. Some people also like to take a screwdriver and cross the terminals on the starter, but whatever works for you is perfectly fine. If you want to do it my way, go ahead and take the lid off your fuse box. And if we look at a chart on the inside, this one right here is going to be your starter. Pull that relay out. And now you can take your jumper wire, mine is this little 10 gauge guy right here, and jump the rear and front terminals that the relay plugged into. That is bridging the relay and the motor will crank over. There you go, easy as that. If you don't have a compression tester, that's okay. You won't be able to determine any of the variance between the cylinders, but you will be able to determine if your engine has enough to run. All you need to do is take a finger. I typically use my middle finger because it's the longest and easiest to reach down into the spark plug hole. You need to cover up that hole for the spark plug and crank the engine over. The engine should have enough compression to want to push your finger out of that hole. If it doesn't, you've got a dead cylinder and you need to start looking at your rings, your valves, your timing, that sort of thing. So here we go, hopefully up close and personal. Here is the number 1 spark plug hole. You guys should be able to hear and see my finger physically jump back out of that hole every time the number 1 compression comes on. So I hope you guys could see that down in there. Now, if I didn't have a compression tester, I would simply run that test on all 6 and call it good enough. However, I do have a compression tester, so I'm going to take some measurements on all 6 of my cylinders. You want to let the motor roll over 4 or 5 times and wait for that value. You're really looking for a 10% range, but that's when the engine is hot. Because this one's cold, 20% will be just fine. And I don't know if you guys can see it, but I've also swapped out my little jumper wire to one with a inline switch. It just makes it a little bit easier. 140, 120, 140, 140 again, 110, 130. So here are our results. You can see number 5 is a little bit low. I'm not too worried about it. Everything looks fine on the plug and it's plenty to run. Now that we've wrapped up with compression and we've determined that's not our issue, there could still be other things at play here, like valve timing or a stretch timing chain, but for the sake of right now, there's not really a point of looking into any of that. There are much more easy things that we could test that are way more likely to cause this thing not to run. Speaking about that, let's move into testing for fuel. The first thing I like to do is check for fuel at the rail. I just went inside the Jeep and turned the key on and then back off. You can take off this cap right here on the rail, and this is called a Schrader valve. If you don't have a fuel pressure gauge, no problem. Take a rag and a screwdriver and just push right there on the tip of that valve. The fuel inside your fuel rail should be pressurized if everything is holding pressure, and it should want to shoot out of there. So as you can see by my wet rag, it shot plenty of fuel out of there, which is good. If you don't get any pressure on the rail, that could mean your fuel pump is bad, your check valve is bad, or your regulator is bad. Looking up my fuel pressure gauge, I'm gonna run inside and cycle the key again. We're looking for 39 PSI with the Jeep off and 31 PSI if it was running. That's for the later model 91 to 95s. If you have an early model 2.5 and it's a TPI, you check your fuel pressure in a different location and you're looking for, I think, 14 or 15 PSI. And if you have one of the 4.2s with a carburetor, it should be about 5 PSI. And you want to also make sure that the gauge is holding pressure. So let me go run in. So I realized that you guys probably couldn't see it, but my fuel pressure gauge did spike up to the proper 39 pounds, but now it's dropped back down to 20. To me, that means that my fuel rail is holding pressure, just not holding enough pressure. Whether that's the check valve at the pump, whether that's the fuel pressure regulator right here, I'm not sure, but either way, that shouldn't be an issue when it comes to this Jeep actually running. Once I get this thing running, I'll come back and measure the fuel pressure again while it's running and make sure everything is good there. On my LS swapped 94, the check valve went out in my Aeromotive pump, and all I had to do was put in an inline check valve, and that solved the same problem. The only issue that could really come from a bad check valve is longer start times. Now, what do you do if you're not getting pressure at the rail? The first thing I like to do is come around to the back of the Jeep and cycle that key on again and listen for the fuel pump. If you're doing this by yourself, you should be able to hear the pump fine from the driver's seat, but in order for the camera to hear it, I think I need to get a microphone pretty close. No clue if you guys heard that, but I certainly did, and you guys will be able to hear it too from your driver's seat. Now, what if you've got no pressure on the rail, you turn your key on, and you don't hear the pump running? We need to make sure that we're getting proper voltage to the pump. This is actually the underside of my 94, but it's all pretty much the same. This one's just a little bit easier to get underneath with the camera. If you take a look under the driver's side back corner, here's the cross member for the gas tank. You've got this plug right here. It goes to your sending unit on top of your gas tank. And here's that 3-wire pump. You've got the fuel pump, the gauge, and the ground. Now, the colors of the wires change between the years, but the way we're going to test it doesn't. The first thing you need to do is figure out which one is your ground. I'm fairly confident it's this black one right here, but let's make sure. I know you guys can't see my multimeter, but I'm probing the pins inside this plug, and I've got a 0 voltage reading when I touch another ground with the red pin. So there we go. This black wire is our ground. Now we need to determine which one of these 3 wires is our sending unit. I've got the key switched to on, so it is sending voltage to the sending unit, and we need to check what it is. It should be somewhere in the range of 5 to 12 volts. If I put this on the middle pin, my multimeter is reading roughly 7.5 volts, which means that this middle wire right here is our signal wire. Now, unfortunately, this isn't the kind of test that you can really do by yourself, but if you have a friend, family member, or pet that can turn the key for you, you can get it done. Take your multimeter, put it on your ground and your pump wire, and have them turn the key. It should read 12 volts for a couple seconds. That would be the pump priming. If it doesn't, you've got an issue with your wiring, your relay, or your fuse. Now, you might ask where that relay and fuse is. If you come around under the hood and take a look at your diagram, you can see that it's this 30 amp fuse right here and this relay all the way over here. If you want to test if your fuse is good, you can use either one of those little fuse checker tools or a multimeter. As far as the relay goes, the easiest way to check that is to use the same jumper wire setup that we used before. That bypasses the relay entirely and takes it out of the equation. Coming around to the inside, there's also a fuse block tucked under the dash up in this corner. And you want to make sure you check fuse number 10. I can't remember if that applies to 91 to 95, or it honestly might be 92 to 95, but it's something in that range. Now, if you've checked your relay and your 2 fuses and all that is good, but you're still not getting any power to the pump, that's where the help I can provide in this video kind of dies out. I can't diagnose your own wiring problems for you, and you'll have to do that by yourself. Thankfully, these Jeeps are popular enough, especially with people that like to work on them, that the wiring diagrams are available for free online. I'll put a link to them in the description below. Back to the back of the Jeep, let's say you are getting 12 volts to the pump and your ground is good, but your pump still isn't kicking on. At this point, more than likely, your fuel pump is faulty and you'll have to replace it. You can either drop the tank, which is what I prefer to do, or if you're like the last guy who owned my Jeep, you could just cut a hole in the floor. Now, if your fuel pump's good, there's only two ways you could have no pressure at the rail. The first one being a direct impingement of the line. That could be the lines itself getting stopped up with rust or even dented in, or your fuel filter could be all clogged up. If you can't think of, off the top of your head, the last time you replaced your fuel filter, just do it. There's no sense in waiting on it. I think they're like $5. As far as the lines go, I think it's best to visually inspect them from front to back and make sure there's no rust holes that you could be leaking fuel out of. Make sure there's no wet spots where fuel could be seeping out of. And make sure no rocks or anything have hit them and caved them in, limiting your fuel flow. The only other way you could have no pressure at the rail is with a bad fuel pressure regulator. If that regulator is locked wide open, that's just letting all the fuel through and not giving it any resistance or any pressure. If you suspect you might have a bad regulator, the only thing you can really do is disconnect your return line right here and be ready for a mess. Doing that allows you to make sure you have proper fuel flow through the rail and it's just your regulator letting everything through. The last component we need to check over in our fuel system is the injectors. The easiest way that I've found to do that is to unbolt the entire fuel rail assembly from the intake and stick each injector in a water bottle. After that, turn on the key like you're trying to start the engine and let it crank over a couple times. That'll accumulate some fuel in each of the water bottles and you can compare them for consistency, and if you kind of know what you're talking about, you can look at the spray patterns as well. I'm not going to do that on this engine because I'm pretty sure I already know what the issue is, and it's with our next category. The third and final category we're going to look at today is spark. It's honestly the one that I see takes these Jeeps off the road most often, and I think that's the case that I've got here. The first thing we need to do is plug one of those spark plugs back in and actually check for spark. There are fancy gizmos and lights to check for spark, but this is the way that I find is easiest. Take a spark plug and stick it back into its boot. After that, you can rest it on a good ground. I'm going to use the AC compressor bracket. Now I'm going to run inside this Jeep and try to start this thing. We should see a nice hot blue spark on the end of that spark plug. If we don't, we've either got a weak spark or no spark at all. So as you can see, I've got no spark and I kind of already knew that. Now, if I was diagnosing any other vehicle, I'd take a look at all the normal stuff. We've already checked out our spark plugs and they look fine. These spark plug wires look fine as well outside of number 6. And I'll take a look at the cap, rotor, and coil towards the end of the video. Because this is a YJ, they have two extremely common spark issues that I'm going to take a look at. The first one is the infamous ECM failure. This little guy right down in here that is unfortunately pretty expensive. A test that works 90% of the time is if you come around to the inside of the Jeep and turn your key to the on position, you should see that check engine light. If you don't see it, there's a pretty good chance either your bulb's burnt out or you need a new ECM. Now, like I said, that's not a 100% method, it just steers you in the right direction. I've seen ECMs that are blown where the light comes on, and I've seen good ECMs where the light doesn't come on. Typically, if your ECM goes out, it's due to the capacitors. If we take a look at this one right here, you can see that these 3 capacitors have been replaced and somebody blobbed this silicone on top of them. Opening up this computer where they haven't been replaced, and you'll have to bear with me because that screw is stripped, you can see capacitor right there, and this one back here. You can even see that that one in the back is a little bit brown. That's not just the camera playing tricks on you. That means that this capacitor is more than likely on its way out. Comparing that to this ECM that I can open up a little bit more, you can see how all 3 capacitors are that shiny silver color. That's what you're looking for. So if you're looking for a used ECM to try to solve these issues, either try to look for one where they've already been repaired from somebody that you trust, or look for one like this one where they're all in good shape. This one in particular is a 91 to 95 4-liter manual, and I keep it around as a spare for this Jeep. I would never sell it to somebody as there's a pretty good chance it would end up going bad. However, the other two, a 2.5 auto and a 4.0 auto, I have no qualms about selling. So if you're looking for one, let me know. If you do need your capacitors repaired, there are services online and people do it for you, or you can pick up a kit and do it yourself. I've done it once before and it's really not that bad as long as you take your time and watch a couple videos. The next thing I'm going to look at is the crank position sensor. I'll get you guys in close to take a look at it. Here's the wire right here and it heads down towards the bell housing. If you unplug it, there are 3 pins on the inside of it. All you need is a multimeter and need to know how to use it. take your multimeter, set it to Greek mode, and set it on B and C. What you're looking for on that multimeter is nothing. You're not looking for 0, you're not looking for a number, you're looking for nothing. The same thing that you would get if you just held the terminals a foot away from each other in the air. That's exactly what you're looking for when you put them on B and C. So I've got the terminals apart right now, and you can see absolutely nothing on the multimeter. That's what we're looking for when we test it. So I don't have enough hands to show you guys the multimeter and probe the sensor, so you'll just have to take my word for it. On the one in the Jeep, we got 2.705. So now that we know that my crank position sensor is indeed bad, let's just buy one off the shelf and replace it, right? Well, wrong. Because no matter what brand you're buying or how much money you're spending on them, there's a 50-50 shot they're bad, brand new, out of the box. I don't know why they can't get it right, but that's just the way it is. To the point where Jeep guys will literally go to the junkyard just to buy a 30-year-old crank position sensor rather than buy an aftermarket one. And I'm going to show you guys why. These are two brand new crank position sensors that I just bought from Rock Auto. If I run that same test, this one's got a correct reading, and this one reads 0.654, which again is not the 0 that we're looking for. So brand new, right out of the box, bad sensor. So obviously I know which one I'm going with. Just make sure if you're looking to replace your crank sensor, always buy two. There's a pretty good chance it'll be bad right out of the box. Well, I went ahead and threw all the spark plugs back in. I also replaced the broken number 6 plug wire and of course the crank position sensor. Now I guess the only thing to do is see if it starts. And there we go, folks. Easy as that. It was the crank position sensor. Is what I would say to you guys if I was going to lie to you. Because this is the internet and through the power of editing magic, I could say whatever I want, and you guys really have no way of telling if I'm lying to you. This thing beat me every which way for the better half of the month. I was posting this issue on Facebook, on Jeep forums, everywhere I could think of, and nobody could come up with a solution. Eventually, I was able to split the diagnostic process into 2 halves, and it brought through a really simple solution. So, after swapping that crank position sensor, here's what really happened. I know I made a big deal previously about the crank position sensor test, and that is the one that's called out in the factory service manual. However, for whatever reason, I don't know if this is a modern parts quality issue or what, but that test doesn't really seem to hold up anymore. For example, the crank position sensor that I have in the Jeep right now doesn't pass that test, and it runs fine. But there is a surefire way to check your crank position sensor, cam position sensor, ASD relay, and ECM all in one go. As a quick disclaimer, this will not tell you which one of those components is bad if it fails the test, but it will tell you if all of them are good. Also, ignore my unloomed wiring. I went through every single inch of this harness just to make sure I didn't have an issue anywhere. So this test is fairly simple. You reach down to your coil plug and unplug it from the coil. And you want to shove both the probes of your multimeter into either end of the plug. And it should read 12 volts or whatever your current battery voltage is. Hopefully you guys can read my multimeter. I'm going to roll the engine over by hand with the key on, and as I rotate the engine around 3 times, we should see this ground break, and you're going to see this go to open loop. There we go, we just hit one. And the reason you need to roll the engine over by hand is it's very quick. It's just an instant where that ground is disconnected, and that coil sends a spark down that wire to the distributor. If you're getting those 3 ground interruptions per rotation of the crank, that means your cam position sensor, crank position sensor, and ASD relay are good. Your ECM is also likely good as well. And that would leave only the other half of your ignition system, which I would call the physical components. Things like your coil, your plug wires, your distributor, or your spark plugs. Or in my case, the one bonus item that I didn't really consider. Now, I am an engineer, but I'm not the electrical variety, so I'm not going to speak out of my field. For whatever reason, the issue that I was having all came down to the battery cables, and you can see that I've gone ahead and made new ones. All I did to test my cables was I checked the continuity from one end to the other, and it was fine, as well as just from the battery to the engine block or the firewall, and it was fine. I also assumed that because the engine was rolling over and not having any issues on the starter, that the connection was good as well. It was not good enough for that coil to be able to spark properly. And you might be asking yourself, well, Sean, all you did was rule out half the ignition system. How did you rule out all the components in the other half? And that comes down to simple diagnostics. I'll start with the coil. It's very easy to set up a redneck test stand, and I'll put a schematic on the screen right now. But all you do is take your positive coil wire and run that over to the positive of the battery. Take your negative coil wire and leave it disconnected. Take your actual coil wire, the one that runs from your coil to the distributor, and shove a spark plug in the end of it. Then you can take that spark plug, put it on the negative terminal of the battery, and take your negative coil wire and hold it on the negative terminal. Every time you pull that negative wire off the negative terminal of the battery, that spark plug should spark. And if it doesn't, you've either got bad connections in your setup or you've got a bad coil. There's ways to measure the primary and secondary windings of a coil using resistance, but I can't remember if it only tests for an open or a short, but it doesn't test for the other way that a coil can fail. Moving on to the plugs, wires, cap, and rotor, it's really a visual test. I've got you guys off the tripod and we're going old school because I'm going to show you how you can probe the cam and crank position sensor, and you don't have to worry about checking the resistance. You can see my multimeter is reading 5 volts. I've got the negative on the negative terminal of the battery, and on the cam position sensor, I've got it on the wire closest to me with the plug in this orientation. With the key on, the 3 wires on the cam position sensor with the plug in that orientation going from driver's side to passenger side is 9 volt ground and 5 volt signal. That 5 volt signal is the one you want to probe. The way both the cam and crank position work is as you rotate the engine around, they will alternate back and forth from 5 volts to 0 volts and send that signal to the computer. I'm on that 5 volt signal wire. I'm going to roll the engine over by hand with the key on, and you guys are going to watch it go from 5 to 0 to 5 to 0 and back and forth. This is not the same as the coil wire. It's not an instantaneous loss of ground. It just goes back and forth as you rotate the engine over. There we go. There's the 0. I'll keep rolling it over until we get back to 5 just to show you guys. There we go, back to 5. And it'll just keep doing that the longer you roll the engine around. So now I know for sure that we have a good cam position sensor and it's sending a proper signal to the computer. And like I said, same deal with the crank position sensor. Again, with this little nub up top, you're probing the wire closest to you on the driver's side. And it should be the 5 volt reference wire. As I rotate the engine around, 5, 0, 5, 0, and I can't see my multimeter, so it'll be up to you guys to tell me what's happening. Now, why did I bring up the ASD relay? Cam position sensor, crank position sensor, that all makes sense, but why ASD? Well, ASD stands for Auto Shutdown Relay, and the purpose of the ASD relay is really just to make sure everything else is working. The short of it is the computer every once in a while, I think it's every 10 seconds or so, is checking to make sure everything else is working with that key on. It does that check by kicking on the fuel pump relay and the ASD relay, basically saying, hey, if you need us to start, we're ready to go. So if you've got a bad ASD relay, essentially your car thinks something else is wrong and it's not going to let it start. The ASD relay is right next to the starter, and if you were doing your last 2 tests for the cam position sensor and the crank position sensor, rolling the engine over by hand with the key in the on position, you should have been hearing the ASD relay and the fuel pump relay kick on every once in a while. The ASD relay and the fuel pump relay share a lot of the same wiring, so chances are if you're getting that fuel pump turning on with the key on, the wiring to the ASD relay is good, but the relay itself could need to be replaced. So what was it that clued me into the fact that it was the battery cables? Honestly, it was the fact that I had already tested everything else, and that's the power of diagnostics. I knew all of my sensors were good, I knew all of my ignition components were good, I knew I didn't have any breaks or shorts in any of the wiring, I knew every single fuse was good, there was literally nothing else that it could have been besides battery cables. So I went to the store, bought all the parts to make some, made them, threw them on, and of course it instantly fired up. Safe to say I was extremely relieved, and the power of diagnostics saved me untold amounts of money on just parts cannoning this thing. I want to be very, very clear that under no no circumstances when you're trying to solve an issue like this should you break out the parts cannon. It's literally always a bad idea. As an example, take the situation that I found myself in here. I had a crank no start issue and it seemed like my crank position sensor was bad. Okay, fair enough. Let's say that was the issue. I go ahead and replace my crank position sensor, but I figure, hey, while I'm at it, let me just throw a new coil on there. I could go, hit the key, and the Jeep no longer starts again. Now, instead of just having one variable, I've got two variables. Do I have a bad coil, or do I have a bad crank position sensor? And it only scales as you swap in more parts. So often do I hear of people trying to diagnose an issue like this, and they say, oh, I've already replaced the coil, crank position sensor, distributor, plugs, wires, spark plugs, and I'm like, hold on, man, like, did you do any diagnostics to try to figure out what it could possibly be before you just threw a ton of variables into your Jeep? The chances of multiple components going bad randomly at the exact same time are pretty low, and that's certainly not where I would start. The best thing you can do, like I've said many times in this video, is take it component by component and rule things out one at a time without swapping them out. In this modern day and age where most of our parts come from overseas, there is no guarantee that any of them are good right out of the box. I apologize for the bit of the rant there, but I know how frustrating crank no starts can be, and I hate seeing these Jeeps get parked for silly issues like that. Like I said at the beginning of the video, it's really only three things: fuel, spark, and air. If you've got those three things and they're happening at the right time, you're good to go. I was planning on giving this thing a tune-up and an engine bay makeover in this video, but I'm gonna push that off until next video. This video is already long enough, so for those of you paying attention to my Beater 91 series, you'll have to wait until next week. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on No Guarantees.
All it needs is a valve and a ring job.
Not for me.
I know, but
Now that we've this is your return line headed down to the tank. No, it's not.